Okay, let me set the mood. It's a rainy winter night in the year 1999, and you pop Silent Hill into your PS1 for the first time. The glow of your CRT bathes the room in the eerie light, but you don't notice because your eyes are fixated on the screen, completely immersed by what is unfolding in front of you. You're terrified by the sights, sounds, and denizens of Silent Hill. The game instills in you a fear that you'll carry for your entire life. And indeed, you weren't alone. Silent Hill frightened gamers around the world with a shocking horror experience, and this title would launch a long-running game series composed of what many would argue are the best horror games of all time. But is this pre-millennium experience recreatable? Or was that night all those years ago lightning in a bottle? What I'm doing this spooky month is exploring some PS1 horror and asking a big question. Is PS1 horror still effective? There should be at least 2 other videos coming out this month addressing this big question, focusing on different PS1 games, but what better place to start than with Silent Hill 1, a game that cannot be ignored just for its lineage alone. So first of all, why am I doing this? Well, as a longtime horror fan, I think it's interesting to observe how horror seems to change with time. What scares audiences seems to change a bit as time passes. Take, for example, The Exorcist. Regarded as a classic horror film, and at the time it was probably the scariest thing that you could watch. But I'm not sure if you show this movie to a person today, they're going to have the same reaction as people in the 70s. And in general, horror movies of today seem to be different than movies of the past. And that's how games feel to me as well. Or did. I've been playing a ton of horror games recently, and I've noticed a trend that many games are intentionally adopting an aesthetic style that's similar to the PS1. And it got me thinking, was that generation of gaming particularly scary? And I'll tell you right now, my personal bias was to assume that no, if I were to play a PS1 game right now, I doubt they'd be as frightening as modern horror. But I'm not stopping there because we're going to test it out and do a deep dive onto PS1 horror, starting with revisiting Silent Hill. I'm your host, the Doom Prophet, and let's find out if PS1 horror is still effective. So, right off the bat, I'm met with a difficult decision. I don't have a capture card, so I'm forced to emulate, and the big question is, do I upscale or leave it in the original pixelated glory? And I'm sure basically no matter what I choose, the people viewing this, you, are going to disagree and say that whatever way you prefer is the best. If I emulate as is, that's going to be the closest experience that night in 1999, but if I upscale, I can pretend it was an HD remaster. Because, as some of you might know, the PS1 models often look a lot better than they actually render out to be. So, which one is the original vision that the developers had? Well, I don't know, and honestly, I kind of like both. So I just put clips in here with both options at random. But that brings us to our first conversation about horror games. Do graphics matter? Is a game with better graphics going to scare you X% more because it had better graphics? Well, I'm not sure, but I've always thought graphics must matter a little bit because it's hard tricking your brain into being scared without a convincing image, right? Well, actually, during my exploration for this video, I think I've changed my mind. And I think that instead of talking about graphics, we should talk about immersion. I think that what actually makes horror effective is immersion. If you're fully immersed in whatever kind of story is being presented, your disbelief is suspended and you're getting invested and potentially frightened by what's happening. And graphics do matter for immersion, right? Better graphics will probably let you get immersed more easily. So better graphics equals better immersion equals better horror, right? Well, that's not all there is to it, as we're about to find out. But I will say that in order to get into the proper zone for playing spooky, scary games, I played all these games at 1 a.m. alone in complete darkness. Because I think it's super hard to be scared of something on a TV at 2 in the afternoon in broad daylight when your neighbor is mowing the lawn or whatever.
Cut it out, Kyle. I'm trying to get immersed.
Okay, starting for real now. So the game opens with a rather bizarre pre-rendered sequence that you probably won't understand at all right now, set to some Godfather music.
The fear of blood tends to crave fear for the flesh. I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
So the premise of this game is that Harry Mason and his daughter Cheryl are visiting Silent Hill for vacation because, believe it or not, Silent Hill's actually a tourist spot. On the way, Harry gets into a car accident and awakens in a daze to find Cheryl missing, so off we go, and ooh, we're in it now. The game instantly hits you with a thick horror atmosphere that Silent Hill is known for. There's a thick fog that barely allows you to see 10 feet in front of you, and a light snow that slightly obstructs your vision. And the music. Ooh, the music. So this game barely has music in the traditional sense, and instead what it has is sound. We're instantly hit with what you might call distant highway noises, or maybe space whales communicating with each other, but somehow it's evil. Whatever it is, the music will constantly have you on edge and tense. So after walking around a bit, Harry sees Cheryl through the fog and begins to chase after her. We duck into an alley and are treated to our first real sign of danger. Nope, nothing wrong here. I'm just gonna go down this dark alley all by myself. There's some pretty suspicious stuff in this nasty alley that's gonna set the tone for this game, and ooh, look at this Dutch angle. This game's gonna be cinematic. Suddenly, we seem to be transported to a nightmare version of reality, a reoccurring theme in this game. Harry comes face to face with something that would mind break most normal people.
What's going on here?
Ben is suddenly attacked by some creatures. Harry passes out and comes to in a diner. Here we meet Sybil. A cop from a neighboring town that's also wondering where everyone is. Sybil leaves a call for reinforcements for whatever is taking place in the town, but leaves Harry with a gun. Yeah, that's right. This game has combat, something that modern horror games tend not to have anymore. So, a big trend with modern horror is making players feel scared by making them mostly helpless. The modern philosophy seems to be that whatever the big bad may be in a game, if you can kill it, it's inherently less frightening. I'm not sure if this is popularized by games like Five Nights at Freddy's or Amnesia, but it definitely feels like as a whole, horror games have moved away from the combat that we saw in titles from this era, like Silent Hill and Resident Evil. So, is combat in horror games actually bad? I'm going to argue no. I think that there are many ways that combat can actually improve a horror game's experience. Now, should combat be the focus, could we have a Devil May Cry style horror game that actually scares you? Probably not, but games like Bloodborne are kind of riding that line. Combat in this game will be Harry using a variety of guns and melee weapons to dispatch the monsters of Silent Hill. Now, Harry isn't some badass 80s movie character, so he's not going to be ripping apart stuff with his bare hands. In fact, he's easily overwhelmed by like 2 monsters. Combat in this game is mostly positioning yourself correctly and being prepared, because Harry's likelihood to hit a target with a gun is based on how long you took to aim. So now we're in Silent Hill proper, and as we begin to explore, the details of the game become apparent. Harry has different animations for different movements, like slamming into a wall and running, or this animation of him falling that I can only activate in this one place in the entire game. If you run for a long enough time, he'll pant and breathe heavily. If you're low on health, the controller will vibrate, a rhythmic reminder that your pulsating heart may soon beat its last. Your footsteps have different sounds on different materials, like see here how this board is all creaky. All these details are contributing towards the immersion of the player. And this is what I was talking about when I started to change my mind on the graphical stuff a little bit. No, the graphics aren't necessarily getting me super immersed, but all the details of the world are adding up to present a cohesive and believable experience. After some work, we eventually make it to the infamous Midwich School. This is our first dungeon of sorts, and we're introduced to a new enemy, besides the dogs and pterodactyls we've been fighting on our way over here. These things sort of read as corrupted children to me, and then you even got these weird shadow babies that can't hurt you, but still activate your radio. Oh, I forgot to mention the radio. Even though radio doesn't seem to work in Silent Hill, radios do serve another function. In this cursed land, the monsters seem to produce some sort of radio wave, so when one is close by, you'll hear various kinds of radio noises. Now, you might be thinking, weird, a horror game that outright tells you when enemies are nearby? That doesn't sound scary. But I'm going to argue it's quite the opposite. Yes, it's true you're not really getting surprised by enemies, but having the constant drone when they're nearby starts to grind on you, contributing to the relentless atmosphere of the game. Also, when there's multiple enemies, there might be multiple different noises you hear, all layered in, letting you know that there's big danger. Anyway, while we're in the school, we're introduced to the puzzles of this game, which are another element that I think some people dislike. Puzzles and riddles and what have yous in games are pretty hit and miss for me, but I'll defend their usage in this game because all the puzzles in this game are bizarre and dreamlike. And since we're basically hanging out in one big nightmare, these dreamlike puzzles don't actually seem out of place to me. Yep, that's my defense of goofy-ass puzzles. We're in a nightmare, so these silly-ass dreamlike solutions make as much sense as anything else. What do you want? Sue me. Don't actually sue me, I'm very poor. So, in Midwich, we get the best scare of the game in my opinion. Harry has to investigate these lockers, and there's obviously something inside of them. After a dramatic build-up, oh, it's just a cat. You just got cat pranked.
I'll get you, and I'll look like a bloody accident.
After solving some of those aforementioned puzzles, we seem to cross over into a nightmare version of the school. It has the same layout, but it's turbo-evilified. Everything is made of rusty metal grates and pipes. There's blood dripping from everywhere, and everything takes on an industrial-looking aesthetic. Now, for me, this is instantly frightening, but I couldn't really tell you why. It seems to me like there's some instinctual reason humans seem to be afraid of the rusty metal visuals that are going on here. Do humans somehow have a natural predisposition to be afraid of this kind of stuff? I don't know, but it works here. From now on, areas in this game will have a normal version of the regular creepy Silent Hill, and then a Turbo Nightmare Demon Dimension version that you'll have to explore as well. Also, here in Midwich, we get maybe my favorite moment in Silent Hill. As you walk by a solitary phone, it begins to ring. Harry picks it up.
Daddy? Help me. Daddy? Where are you?
Cheryl!
It's Cheryl, with a plea for help. A truly haunting moment. So we're trying to conquer the nightmare version of the school. We return to the locker that gave us the cat prank scare earlier. Now this time it's definitely going to be something worse than a cat, right? Wait, it's nothing? The double, triple, reverse prank. For me, this worked perfectly, and I love that the devs are trying this hard way back in 1999. At the end of the school, we have to face up against the first boss of the game. Now this guy's a total pushover, but the boss arena is actually a hellish nightmare. Really effective in conveying the terrible situation that Harry's in. When we kill this lizard demogorgon thing, the school seems to revert to its normal Silent Hill version, and suddenly the scary fog doesn't seem so bad compared to the hell we were just enduring. After finishing off the school, Harry is summoned to a church where he meets resident crazy lady Dahlia. Dahlia is our first big clue that the main plot of this game revolves around the central theme of a crazy cult.
It was foretold by gyromancy.
It was foretold by what? It's time to consult the ancient tome. Yes, here it is. Gyromancy. A kind of divination performed by walking around in a circle or ring. Oh, that's what you guys call that? Alright, fair enough. So let's talk cults. Cults are sort of a classic horror trope because they are in fact very scary. Imagine arriving in a town that's ruled by cultists, followers of some backwards beliefs that want to sacrifice you to some ancient demon. And that's like a solid 10% of horror because it preys on a primal fear of humans. Being the lone outsider in a group of people with crazy beliefs. This game, in fact, makes reference to real-world beliefs. The big threat in this game is the cultist summoning Samael, and there are many other references to the Olympian spirits. Using these figures from the Judeo-Christian mythology is an interesting choice, and I think an effective one, because many people inherently believe and are afraid of these demonic figures. After some wandering around in a new section of the city, we find ourselves in the hospital, and the soundtrack is really turning up the tension. Hospital's another sort of creepy place, probably due to their close proximity to death. Like with the school, we have to figure out how to get into the nightmare version, which involves a very well done sequence where Harry must repeatedly explore the floors by traveling on an elevator. When you explore the third and final floor and find it's a dead end, Harry will return to the elevator and find that it now has a mysterious fourth floor button. Now I might be mistaken, but I believe this is a reference that may only work in Japanese culture. Apparently, it's sometimes tradition to skip the fourth floor in Japanese hospitals, as 4 can also be read as part of the verb for death. Anyway, we find ourselves on the nightmare floor, which is our gateway in, and...
A woman!
Whew, sorry, I haven't seen a lot of those. I grew up in a monastery with all men. Anyway, this is the only area of the game where the enemies seem to be human, or at least humans controlled by some type of parasite. And I genuinely feel bad for killing them because they appear to be in a great deal of pain. Again, a nice little detail that conveys some information to us, the player. So let's talk about the enemies in this game. All of them besides the ones in the hospital are variations on animals or your standard ghouls. The enemy design is probably the weakest part of the game for me, especially since later on in the Silent Hill series we get designs that will stick in your mind forever. Most of the enemies in this game are sort of generic in their looks. However, that's not to say they're not threatening. One enemy at a time isn't a particular problem, but if you get swarmed, you're in big trouble. Now, if you're playing on normal, I wouldn't call this game hard, but I do appreciate that you can easily die to just a few of the smaller mob enemies. Okay, now I'm going to segue into difficulty in horror games. So, I am of the opinion that horror games should be difficult. Besides the scares that horror games are able to deliver when you're immersed in the atmosphere of a game, how else can a game frighten you? Well, it can make you afraid of losing progress, and when you really think about it, does a video game have any other ability to affect us in real life at all? Until we invent the next level of VR technology where games can physically beat me up when I lose, one of the scariest things that can happen to me in a game is losing a tremendous amount of progress. Just think about the Souls games. Have you ever died and lost a ton of souls, and then when you're trying to retrieve them, you're actually scared of the prospect of losing them? I personally think horror games work better when they're difficult. If you're playing super cautiously to avoid dying and having to redo that one part that's scary or difficult, I think that's very much in the spirit of horror games. And I can't tell you how many games have completely lost their edge to me when I realized that dying essentially has no consequences. Imagine a game is making you fight a super hard and terrifying enemy, but when it kills you, you can instantly respawn and are able to continue right where you left off. Eventually, this is going to train your brain that these things aren't real threats at all, and the horror element is going to vanish completely. After finishing up our business at the hospital, we meet Lisa.
You are tearing me apart, Lisa!
We head to the antique shop where we'll pick up some more clues about the cult's activities.
What the?
And after this point in the story, the entire town of Silent Hill begins shifting into the nightmare zone rather than just isolated areas like the school or hospital. Also, up until now, it's feasible that you might have dispatched every enemy you encountered, but after this point, no more. Silent Hill is now absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of enemies, and I refuse to believe there's even enough ammo in the game to get rid of them all. This marks a bit of a turning point in the game for me, and I feel like totally after this point, the game gets a lot less, well, scary. You go through a sewer level, everyone's favorite, then the touristy part of Silent Hill where you have the option of doing a bunch of side quests to get the good ending of the game, then you'll go to the pier, then the sewers again, then a haunted amusement park, which I guess is kind of scary, and then the final endgame dungeon, which is the other areas of the game but stitched together into a weird geometric maze. Is the back half of the game bad? No, not by any means, but in terms of fright factor, I think most of the scares in this game are front-loaded. Once you've reached about the halfway point of the game, it doesn't necessarily offer you anything new in terms of horror. So instead of talking about all those areas in detail, I'll just talk about what I learned from this experience. So going into this, as I mentioned, I was of the opinion that older games are probably not going to be as scary as modern ones, and I think I've changed my mind. Now, I've beat Silent Hill loads of time in the past, but it's been a while since I've played through, and I've sort of forgotten about all the details of this game, and details matter. Like I said earlier, I think the most important thing for a horror game is your immersion, and I assume that having realistic graphics is one of the easiest ways to get that immersion. However, while Silent Hill may not have photorealistic graphics, the ambiance and the atmosphere are photorealistic. What did he mean by that? Well, to put it as simply as I can, the details of Silent Hill add up to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Silent Hill is incredibly immersive, but it's definitely not on the strength of the graphics. Despite the game being pretty dated visually, the world draws me in and immerses me more than many modern games do. There are so many little details in the world of Silent Hill that makes it believable. The town has all these posters and advertisements up, the school has a bunch of actual school stuff, the layout of all the buildings in the town actually makes sense instead of being sculpted around being a video game dungeon. The sounds, the sights, even the dialogue you get from Harry when you examine stuff all makes me feel immersed in the world, and therefore able to be scared. Does the game have any outright weak elements? Yeah, for me, the enemies, as I mentioned earlier, aren't particularly memorable to me. They're mostly just goobers. You've got flying goobers and ground goobers, and that's kind of it. The bosses are also pretty underwhelming. I still really like the first boss just because of the arena he's in, but besides that, they don't really have a lot going for him. Sybil and the final boss have story significance, but the rest are just large monsters. Now, I bet you thought I was going to mention the voice acting here, but to be honest, it doesn't really bother me. I'm not even sure it's bad so much as it is badly directed. It kind of just sounds like they were given lines with no direction on how to read them, or what their place in the story was.
I haven't gone crazy, and I'm not fooling around.
Was that a good take or do we need another one? Huh? Oh, sounds good, man. Hey, I'm starving. You want to get out here and grab some Waffle House? Yeah, sounds good. Anyway, what did we learn today? Well, PS1s can still be scary due to things like atmosphere, ambiance, and details. Maybe there's even a little bit of that uncanny valley going on, making them scarier than they would be normally. Is Silent Hill the scariest game I've ever played? No. But it still works like 20-something years later. It's a great showcase of how when a developer cares about the little things in a game, it's actually going to matter in the long run. Did the devs know that by putting in all that stuff from Kindergarten Cop that weirdos like me would be making videos about their game decades later? Who knows? Anyway, like, comment, and subscribe, all the normal stuff, and come back next week when I go undercover as a Japanese student in Iru, and we'll find out if that game is still scary. Alright, the end is nigh. Doom Prophet out.